Good morning, and welcome to the first day of the 30th Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide hosted by Vanier College. My name is Melissa Michael, and I'm the Director of Education with Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. We were pleased to join the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation to support Vanier College in this important week-long program. If you have any questions as our speaker is presenting this morning, please enter them in the Q&A box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Jeff Benvenuto this morning, someone that I've had the privilege to learn from in my own PhD program. Professor Benvenuto is an adjunct professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. He's a contributing co-editor of Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America and has published in the Journal of Genocide Research and Genocide Studies and Prevention. Currently, he is co-authoring a book on critical genocide studies and prevention, as well as revisiting his dissertation work on human rights, settler colonialism, and the normalcy of assimilation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Benvenuto.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning, everyone. So to begin, I'd like to honor the land acknowledgement protocol that is becoming increasingly familiar in Canada, at least much more so than compared to my country, the United States. So I'm speaking today from home in northern New Jersey, where I acknowledge my presence as an uninvited guest in a country called Lenape-Hoking, or the traditional homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. Now, I'm doing this not as an exercise in virtue signaling. Rather, it's necessary to situate myself as an implicated subject in the settler colonial present, as well as a beneficiary of settler colonialism and genocide. It's important to acknowledge this and to immediately disturb what may be a taken for granted notion that genocide is somehow a foreign problem. It's something that other people do, not us, right? So look at this cover image from Samantha Power's highly acclaimed book about America and genocide. Those eyes peering through the window blinds are suggestive. It's as if they're seeing genocide happening somewhere out there in the world beyond the safe confines of our domestic abode. But what's going on inside the house? What's hidden from sight here? And how does this foreign gaze inhibit our ability to see genocide closer to home? So I'm starting with the premise that the anti-genocide movement is itself implicated in the very systems that have produced this odious scourge in the first place. So for example, the UN headquarters on the east side of Manhattan Island is also on Lenape-Hoking. And despite the mythology about the Dutch purchase of Manhattan from the Indians, this region has its own hidden legacy of violence. In the mid-17th century, in present-day Jersey City, right across the Hudson River from Lower Manhattan, Dutch colonists massacred a group of Lenape refugees who were fleeing from colonial-induced warfare over the fur trade in the greater Northeast. I'll spare you the details of this incident, which is known as the Pavonia Massacre, but suffice it to say that today, not so much as a marker recognizes what happened here. Like other settler colonial societies, there's been a systemic disavowal of the foundational violence that produced the United States. This denialism, I argue, inhibits the effectiveness of our anti-genocide campaign. Now, one could argue that the Pavonia Massacre wasn't a genocide per se. Indeed, the question of conceptual applicability of whether or not the G word applies has pretty much dominated the literature. So here you see a sample in reference to the Powhatan War in mid-17th century colonial Virginia. But this question has been asked countless times, quote, but was it genocide? Now, on the surface at least, it may seem natural for definitional clarity to be a necessary point of analytical departure. At a deeper, more critical level, however, this very scholarly principle has also tended to shut down the discussion on genocide in Native Americans. So let's break down this question to see how that denialism works. So to begin with, the question starts with the word but, which grammatically speaking expresses opposition or contrast. In other words, the question is immediately framed as an either or, either yes, genocide happened, or no, it did not. Much of the scholarly and political debate has been programmed by this black and white binary response mechanism. Secondly, the question is framed in the past tense. But as we'll see, the historical record isn't that old. After all, the last Indian residential schools in Canada didn't close until 1996. But by quarantining such injustices to history alone, not only do we fail to see how genocide and other forms of mass violence mutate across space and time, but we could also miss the crucial warning signs today. I'll come back to that at the end. Thirdly, the pronoun it begs the question of what the it is that we're trying to explain. As you can see, the indigenous peoples of North America suffered a demographic cataclysm after 1492, something on the measure of a 95% population decrease. Yet by framing the question on such a large scale, covering a half millennium of history across an entire continent, we fail to see the uneven effects and the diverse experiences of indigenous settler relations. Likewise, by just focusing on population losses, we fail to see other important indicators, such as with the number of indigenous languages that are either extinct or endangered. And finally, we come to this most problematic part of the question, which itself begs the big question of what is genocide? As you see here, the concept of genocide is comprised of a number of conceptual elements, all of which can be interpreted on sliding scales. So for example, if genocide is the destruction of a group, then what qualifies as a group, as designated by the prefix genos? What is a genos? Should it be restricted to the specific group types that are delineated in the UN Genocide Convention? Not all groups are constituted the same way. So what if we take a more culturally relativistic approach that opens up more subjective interpretations of the genos? What about the CDE or the side element? The tendency has been to narrowly conflate genocide with mass murder, despite the fact that the international legal definition includes other broader means of destruction, including the forcible removal of children. Oops, sorry, that we need to go that way. Likewise, we understand that genocide is a crime of intent, but what kind of intent? Again, the tendency has been to focus on a narrower form of specific intent rather than a broader form of intent that legal scholars call a knowledge-based interpretation, so as to cover recklessness and other forms of indirect agency. Finally, the bottom here, the concept of Mariology pertains to what the Genocide Convention qualifies as the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. So what constitutes a sufficient part of a group? How many people must be killed? How much must be destroyed before it becomes genocide? And for all of these elements, it is essentially a question of thresholds, the assumption being that there is a certain point or boundary that divides genocide from non-genocide. But who gets to draw the line? Who gets to decide what counts? As an essentially contested concept, we'll never be able to agree upon a timeless universal definition, and nor should we. Genocide is a mutable phenomenon, the same way that Karl von Clausewitz said that war is like a chameleon, meaning that the character and nature of genocide, like warfare, varies according to context. Yet, rather than attending to the complexity of genocide as a dynamic social phenomenon, the tendency has instead been to fix it to a narrow, highly exclusive meaning. This opens the door to a form of denialism that genocide scholar Israel Charney calls definitionalism, which involves an obscene level of obsessive hair splitting over semantics, to a point where one loses sight of the actual phenomenon under discussion. Definitionalism is manifest in multiple ways in the literature on genocide and Native Americans. So today I'm going to look at three typical counter-arguments against the proposition that genocide is an entirely appropriate concept in this context. The first is the counter-argument that the demographic catastrophe of indigenous peoples was caused by disease, not genocide. although a variation of this argument is that the destruction of indigenous peoples was a consequence of war, not genocide. Second is the proposition that the massive dispossession of indigenous territories was, at worst, a form of ethnic cleansing, not genocide. Finally, the removal of indigenous children and or the extinction of indigenous languages was, quote unquote, merely a form of cultural genocide, not, quote unquote, real genocide. Notably, these all follow the same logical structure, whereby the keyword genocide is simply substituted with another, presumably less controversial synonym. Moreover, they all tend to skew towards a much narrower and more exclusive conceptualization, thereby limiting its applicability to settler colonial North America and further fixing our foreign gaze away from home. Now, let's take a closer look at these three counter-arguments in turn. Let's start with the first counter-argument, which is perhaps the most common, and that is the misconception that it was disease, not genocide. It was basically a terrible and unfortunate accident what happened to the Indians, and that it couldn't be genocide because the spread of disease was unintentional. This is a fairly typical assumption and not without reason. After all, old world diseases were indeed a factor in indigenous population loss. The key explanatory device in this counterargument is the notion of virgin soil epidemics. In a straightforward logic of this hypothesis that mass death was caused by the lack of prior immunity fails biomedical and historical scrutiny. And for the best account of this, by the way, check out this book you see here, which was authored by someone with a joint PhD in history and a medical degree. Anyways, all humans, except those, of course, with immunocompromised diseases, have powerful immunological defenses, even those in isolated populations. Moreover, bioarchaeological evidence suggests that the concept of a pristine, disease-free, pre-Columbian New World environment is no longer credible. As an overgeneralized monocausal explanation, this argument is an extremely reductive form of immunological determinism, one that deflects attention away from the underlying social factors that enabled the spread and deadly impact of diseases in the first place. By shifting our focus from these broader social forces, this thesis naturalizes mass death, thereby evoking Victorian-era racist tropes, such as the dying Indian. By whitewashing mass death, this counterargument also alleviates settler guilt and perpetuates long-standing settler fantasies, such as the doctrine of terra nullius, or the notion that the quote-unquote New World was an unpopulated wasteland. But of course, North America wasn't deserted when Europeans came, nor was disease the sole factor in precipitating a demographic catastrophe. In fact, as far as pre-Columbian Eastern North America was concerned, there was a social and political world dominated by complex chiefdoms known as the Mississippian culture. So when the first Europeans penetrated North America by the mid-16th century, they encountered these densely populated and politically formidable polities that prevented, or at least forestalled, colonization. When the next Europeans arrived and penetrated the continent about 150 years later, all of these old Mississippian chiefdoms were gone, and out of their shattered remnants emerged a new generation of indigenous polities. This collapse and transformation was caused by several interrelated variables. First was the inherent structural instability of pre-colonial Mississippian chiefdoms, which were relatively large, hierarchical polities that collapsed under the combined stresses of other factors. This resulted in mass refugee movements, which in turn left populations susceptible to disease. Although rather than visualizing European diseases as pandemics sweeping across the entire region, they should instead be viewed as torrents following corridors of least resistance, occasionally dying out in cul-de-sacs. So there was a significant degree of local variability in terms of intra-regional spread and impact of disease vectors, the flows and pathways of which were structured by even broader social forces, particularly with the incorporation of the entire region into the global political economy. This introduced new economic incentives for commercial trade, first in animal skins, later in slaves. The latter led to endemic slave raiding and internecine warfare, which in turn produced situations of mass violence that are recognizable through the analytical lens of genocide studies. So that was it was disease, not genocide argument, or at least the version of counter argument number one. The other version of this counter argument is that it was war, not genocide. So here we can look at the American settler colonization of California, especially in the 1850s and 60s, as magisterially covered in Ben Madley's seminal book that you see here, which, among other things, looks at the paramilitarization of American settler society, which sort of gave it a freelance, or even dare say, democratic character. The book also highlights a recurring dynamic that marked settler indigenous conflicts on the frontier. There is a fairly typical pattern involved with the process of escalatory violence. Basically, as settlers flooded an area, subsequent ecological changes disrupted indigenous subsistence patterns, leading to the theft and killing of livestock, which in turn led to the rise of settler vigilantism, with settlers often responding with indiscriminate and disproportionate reprisals. This escalatory dynamic provided a justification that tended to camouflage or sanitize genocide in the historical record. According to this logic, it couldn't be genocide, which is presumed to be a devastatingly one-sided affair, as opposed to the presumably more equitable circumstances of warfare. So in other words, if genocide involves agentless victims, then war is distinguished by a presumably more equitable distribution of power. Yet this assumption belies the fact that most genocides occur in the context of war, and it casts an overly simplistic perspective of the social relations of genocide. Let's move on to the second general misconception, which is that what happened to the Indians was ethnic cleansing, not genocide. There have been a number of different strategies for indigenous dispossession, such as forced removals, reservation allotments, and the termination of federally recognized tribes. All of these strategies share the same overriding objective in terms of expropriating indigenous territories. What's happened to indigenous bodies has been of lesser concern. Of course, many indigenous peoples have collectively put their individual bodies on the line to resist settler colonialism, even while facing the dim prospects of detention, murder, and sometimes even massacre. But the disposal of individual indigenous bodies has been a secondary outcome of a larger, seemingly inexorable process geared towards the massive transfer of indigenous lands and the settler property regimes. So even in such cases where human disposal turned into mass killings, indigenous peoples were destroyed for ostensibly instrumental reasons. It was because of where they were, not who they were. And I'll come back to this particular part of the misconception in a moment. But the underlying assumption is that indigenous peoples have not been physically annihilated because of their identity, unlike the Jews during the Holocaust, for example. So according to this overly simplistic logic, there was no quote unquote final solution in indigenous North America, no universal offensive against Indians per se. This is the argument of historian Gary Clayton Anderson, whose book here is a textbook case of definitionalism. He uses the Holocaust as a prototype to fix the meaning of genocide according to a very high threshold. Anything that falls short of that high threshold falls into other seemingly less stigmatizing categories. He sees the ethnic cleansing of the Indians as a less egregious alternative to their utter extermination. And it couldn't have been genocide, he reasons, because so many Indians survived. Now, there are a number of problems with this argument, not the least of which is the fact that survival doesn't negate genocide. Moreover, the very terminology of ethnic cleansing is morally problematic and should probably only be used with scare quotes. After all, it was originally coined as a perpetrator's euphemism, designed as a form of terminological denial and an ideological justification. Analytically, moreover, there's a problem with drawing the distinction between genocide and ethnic cleansing. Proponents tend to view these two concepts along a spectrum, with forced deportations and population transfers at one end, and massacres and annihilation at the other. Yet, like any spectrum, there's a series of indistinguishable steps in between, where one bleeds into the other. So in other words, there's no clear conceptual boundary between the two. Another analytical distinction often made by proponents is that ethnic cleansing targets victims based on not who they are, but where they are. But for many indigenous peoples, where they are is who they are. So for example, this is a picture of Naniwaya in present-day central Mississippi, an ancient burial mound known as the mother of the Choctaw people. To understand how the Choctaw are attached to this location, we need to take into consideration their ontology or worldview. As with most ontologies, indigenous ontologies, that is, the Choctaw see themselves as comprised of a number of relationships, not just between biological kin, but fictive kin as well. So in this sense, this mound really was and is a family member of the Choctaw. Thus, their removal from this land in the 1830s was an act of ontological destruction, or an attempt to destroy the material and symbolic ties that constituted the Choctaw as a people. This reference to ontology, or the philosophical study of existence, as well as the critical question of what it is that genocides actually kill, raises our third and final misconception, that cultural genocide is not equivalent to quote unquote real genocide. Now, the term cultural genocide initially appeared in the first draft of the 1948 Genocide Convention, where it represented a broad sociological conception that originally defined the genocide concept. Yet a provision against the brutal destruction of the specific characteristics of a group was controversially omitted from the final draft, largely at the behest of the United States and other Western powers, including Canada. Quite simply, the official legal meaning of genocide was crafted in such a way as to avoid any possible self-incrimination. This was the origin of the foreign gaze that I spoke of earlier. And until recently, at least, the scholarly consensus was that cultural genocide is analytically different from the physical extermination of a group. The term cultural genocide is thus often set within inverted commas, as if to suggest a non-literal status, something close to but not quite the same as the real thing. The effects of cultural genocide have thus been said to be merely symbolic and thus reversible, whereas what is presumed to be an actual genocide necessarily involves mass killings. So this is based on the mistaken idea that genocide is about the biophysical extermination of individual human bodies rather than the social destruction of groups. According to this narrow logic, when the life of an individual body remains, as in cultural genocide, it is tenuously assumed that there also remains the possibility of individual and then group revival. Once again, we can use a broader and more nuanced approach to deconstruct this typical misconception. In the first place, the semantic formulation of cultural genocide was originally intended to refer to a particular type of genocide in the generic sense. It was analogous to other categories of the crime, such as physical or biological genocide. So without collapsing the distinctions within this classification system, we can conceive of genocide as a capacious and totalizing social practice. This sociological approach enables us to appreciate the similarities and differences between, say, the Nazi gas chambers and book burnings as two methods of genocide. Certainly, the former involved a more extreme form of lethality compared to the latter. Strictly speaking, acts of cultural genocide like book burning, the destruction of artifacts, or in the case of settler colonial countries, the forcible removal of indigenous children, acts like this are not entirely equivalent to acts of physical genocide like mass killings. Sociologically, however, these dissimilar methods are different means to the same end. After all, many indigenous children lost their lives in the Indian residential school system. The point here is that we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss cultural genocide. And this gets us back to the ontological question about what it is that genocides kill. Frankly, the cultural history of the Holocaust would be incomplete without looking at the book burnings, which was part of a larger social process aiming to kill European Jewry on an existential level. Similarly, the Indian residential school was a site of cultural destruction as well as biophysical death. And one last point regarding that pesky misunderstanding about genocide and survival. As I said, the former does not preclude the latter. So the fact that most Indigenous children physically survived the residential schools should not overlook the fact that these were sites of genos killing. In sum, I've addressed 3 popular misconceptions about the historiography of settler colonialism and genocide in Indigenous North America, although they all follow the same rhetorical form of definitionalism. In each case, quote unquote, real genocide is categorically distinguished from other, presumably less stigmatizing conceptual categories, whether it be virgin soil epidemics, ethnic cleansing, or cultural genocide. This alternative vocabulary has a tendency for misuse as genocide denial. In response to the intellectual shortcomings of this overly categorical approach based on a narrow legalistic reasoning, the field of genocide studies has increasingly begun to favor a sociological conception of genocide as a totalizing social practice that involves multiple dimensions of group destruction. As well, the field has begun to follow an ethnographic sensibility that accounts for the different ways that group life and destruction are variously experienced. This more dynamic and flexible approach, I should add, can also shed light on the underappreciated role of land and territory as part of the genos of genocide. In conclusion, it is absolutely crucial for us to break out of the foreign gaze of genocide and instead see how we are implicated in the very structures that produce genocide in the first place. There are 2 good reasons for such a reckoning. First, by coming to terms with our own legacies of genocide, we undercut the very cynical but not entirely unwarranted charges of double standards that contemporary genocide perpetrators often use to deflect attention away from their own criminal records. Secondly, we must appreciate that we're not out of the woods just yet in terms of the risk of genocide recurring. In fact, one of the most crucial risk factors for genocide, one of the variables that makes future genocides more likely, is the presence of a prior historical record of genocide or other human rights violations. Basically, if we did it before, there's a good chance it could happen again, especially in a climate of impunity. No country is without risk. And instead of endlessly debating about whether or not the G word applies here at home, we should instead adopt a risk management perspective in an attempt to identify and rectify the factors that may enable the recurrence of genocide. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, Professor Benvenuto. Thank you so much. Thank you for unpacking some of these misconceptions that I'm sure we've all heard, and I think it's an important, absolutely important conversation. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please do enter them into the Q&A box. We're happy to take those questions for you. I just wanted to zero in actually on something very relevant to Canada. You mentioned the residential schools, and just this past week, we had a very significant apology that was made by the Pope. There was a delegation of a variety of different Indigenous communities who traveled to Vatican City and received an apology. I'm wondering if you can talk, I know it kind of wanders a little bit off of, the genocide piece, but if you can talk a little bit about the significance of these apologies, because we see them in a variety of different fields under this umbrella of genocide. What's the significance of those apologies? What, are they important, and what do they actually mean?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think they are very important as first steps, right? So I think there's a danger that, apologies by themselves, can kind of sort of be insufficient and, almost kind of be used to almost dismiss, almost kind of being dismissive, like, look, we apologize. Okay, we're good. We move on. Without any sort of material reparations, especially in the form of land, apologies are insufficient. So lest apologies become simply just another form of, solving the Indian problem, so to speak, without some form of material reparations, it's just too easily, it becomes a form of co-optation, just co-opting indigenous resistance, you know. So yeah, I think without that type of, and that remains to be seen, you know, particularly in regards to the Catholic Church, which was responsible for a majority, I believe, of administering the residential schools, without sort of ponying up, you know, and it's not just about like, you know, cutting a check, which I think has been sort of, well, that's the easiest way, you know, to kind of to provide material reparations is to just write a check, right? And, you know, the Canadian TRC process had a very sort of intricate, like almost literally an equation of how they measured, you know, how much money former students would get. Yeah, I mean, that as well is the kind of an insufficient form. I mean, really, true justice, it all boils down to land, right? And there has to be some form of material reparations in terms of returning land. And I can talk more about what that means. I mean, I'm not talking about, you know, the settlers aren't going back to Europe or anywhere else in the world where they came from. I mean, the settlers are here to stay. And coexistence is a prerequisite here. So, you know, I'm not talking about kicking settlers off the land and giving it back to the Indians. I mean, I can talk more about that later, but that is my answer though. Without any form of material reparations, symbolic gestures like apologies are insufficient. However, you know, they are important steps, and making symbolic gestures like public apologies are very important as part of a larger process.
And I think that that's what we're seeing, you know, the apology, certainly what we're hearing from different communities, it's been appreciated, but it needs to be backed up with those steps, with those action pieces. Can you talk a little bit more about the land and what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we haven't seen a lot of examples of this. One example we did see it was in California, and near Humboldt, California. It's in Northern California, near the city of Eureka. There is an island, and the name is escaping me, the name of the island. There's a terrible massacre at this island in like the 1850s, right? And, you know, like most of the United States, you know, land was, you know, essentially stolen, right? A few years ago, the city council, the town council of Eureka, California, agreed to return this island to, oh God, and the tribe is escaping me too. This is a Californian tribe. I beg your pardon for forgetting all the details. This is an example, however, of a local initiative towards land reparations. Although it should be noted as well that by returning the land, the tribe still has to pay taxes to the county and to the state, right? So it's not exactly like, you know, they're getting their land back entirely. I mean, it's still, you know, it's just fee simple property, right? Like anyone else would have to pay taxes. Nevertheless, I mean, like this is a type of measure of, you know, land reparations. You know, like to use a different example, a contrary example, but something that's a bit more high profile, has been the Black Hills in South Dakota, which has been the site of a long-standing land dispute going back, you know, decades. I mean, really over a century, I mean, since it was stolen, really. The Black Hills in South Dakota, where the Mount Rushmore is, you know, this great icon of American nationalism on stolen land, essentially. The Supreme Court ruled in 1980, yes, the land was stolen, and that in this case it was the Great Sioux Nation, the Lakota people in particular, were entitled to a great monetary sum, like millions and millions of dollars at the time. And you know, very famously, the Lakota, you know, said the Black Hills are not for sale. They wouldn't take the money. The money's been sitting in an escrow account since then, collecting interest. It's like it's over $1 billion now or something like that. It's hundreds of millions of dollars at least, right? And the Lakota, and you know, this is basically, you know, the reservations in South Dakota are essentially, by, you know, according to social indicators, equivalent to third world countries, right? Like they could use a massive influx of cash, right? But they're not going to sell out. right? They want the land. They don't want the money. So yeah, this is a countervailing example of what material reparations should look like, right? In terms of land, not just we're going to write you a check. Basically, we're going to buy you off, right? Like that's just not that's wholly insufficient. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of good examples, and frankly, I haven't been keeping up with news in Canada, so I don't know of any examples from Canada of positive example of land reparations. I don't know actually.
Thank you. Someone wrote in Miwok, I think for the tribe name that you were thinking of.
Yes,
is that
that's
correct?
right, yeah.
Okay. So a question that's come in is as follows. California is actively involved in deciding to give reparations to African Americans with historical ties to slavery. What about Indians? What should the USA be doing for them? Is it too late? Have the Indians formed a culture of alcoholism, obesity, not joining an upwardly mobile education system that will not be impacted by reparations?
Well, yeah, I'll address the substantive part of that question first. I would say that, first of all, what's holding Indigenous peoples back isn't their, internal cultural habits or whatever. I mean, these are, like most, underserved and underprivileged communities, they're faced with, enormous odds against them. So like alcoholism, for example, it's not a moral failing of Indigenous peoples as much as a reflection of the social circumstances that they're in. Is it too late? No, it's never too late. What can be done? Yeah, I mean, look, I'm talking about land reparations, and I mentioned earlier, I don't think anyone seriously is talking about kicking settlers off the land and, transferring private property. The fact is, especially in the United States, especially out west, but across the entire continent, and the same probably true of Canada as well, but especially in the US, the federal government owns a lot of land, especially out west. So do state governments. Publicly held lands, those I think are the targets for reparations, for returning lands, right? I'm not talking about private property, publicly owned lands as these are the material assets that need to be returned. Now, of course, it's complicated, right? I mean, like, not all Indigenous peoples today. So for example, like the Lenape, I referenced at the outset, who are originally indigenous to, where I live now in North Jersey. Now the Lenape are a diasporic people. They live, there are a few remnants here in New Jersey still, but they're in Oklahoma, right, and like Minnesota and California. I mean, they're spread across the entire continent. Many reservations are actually collections of different tribes, that have basically been hodgepodge together, right? So like, by virtue of a legacy of dispossession and removal, like not all Indigenous peoples live where they lived before. And, by virtue of the history of dispossession, yeah, they're not necessarily going to be getting their traditional homelands back under this kind of proposal or whatever. So yeah, the mechanics of this are all very, very tricky. But at least like this is a general idea that's been floated. I mean, frankly, unfortunately, given the political reality, it's not yet a very serious proposal, unfortunately. But this is a type of, if you're kind of trying to envision what would this look like? Yeah, the transfer of publicly held lands back to Indigenous peoples is, I think, a feasible and just proposal that would not interfere with the private property rights of settlers, but would sort of, be some modicum of actual material justice. Yeah, so I think that's kind of maybe a possible vision here. Yeah.
I like where you started that. It's never too late. A second question, and this is a question that I guess, it would be so nice to it's a hindsight question, I guess. It would be nice to know in the circumstances, what the path was going to be to make this decision. But in your opinion, how could this genocide have been prevented?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think on a very philosophical level, I mean, I think there had to be some sort of basis for coexistence, which I think we've seen examples of this really. I think, very famously, well, in the Canadian example, for example, the Métis people, as the Métis people were basically, the ethnogenesis of an entirely new people based on the offspring of indigenous and Europeans, right? I mean, like the existence of the Métis people is a testament to coexistence, right? And we see other parts of the historical record. I mean, I think really the foundation myth of Canada is in large part premised. It is mythology. I mean, it's not entirely false. A lot of it has been mythologized, but nevertheless, the vision of Canada as sort of based on this sort of coexistence. I mean, I think at the very least that would have been a basis for prevention, and like I said, we've seen examples of that. I think on a structural level, I don't know, it has something to do with the way that our property regimes are structured, right? And the way that, private property is sacrosanct, right? And the expansion of private property, I mean, like it's sine qua non for the existence of our social system, right? Our political economic system, as it has been for hundreds of years now. And I think that's been part of the problem as well, is this inexhaustible drive for more, right? Especially in terms of property. I mean, that's been the engine that's been driving this process of dispossession, really. So yeah, I mean, thinking retrospectively, counterfactually, how could it have been prevented? I think to have some form of brakes on this, this inexorable machine of the expansion of private property, I think that having some form of brakes on the expansion of private property would also be an important prerequisite in this counterfactual. But there's so many other factors that contribute to, and so many other risk factors for genocide. I mean, these are only just, certain elements really. But yeah, I mean, to speak to the principle, the underlying principle of the question, I mean, yes, it could have been prevented. All genocides can be prevented. Nothing is destined. And those are, two possible ways that, by kind of contributing the sort of ideology of coexistence and putting brakes on the expansion of private property regimes. I think those are two big ones, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a very specific question, or a question around a specific incident. Can you please comment on the Fort Laramie people eviction of the Grand Getaway Hotel?
Oh, I'm not familiar with this particular hotel incident. I mean, to geographically situate this, Fort Laramie is in South Dakota, or present-day South Dakota, part of the Black Hills, part of the Great Sioux Nation. And I mean, so kind of just geographically situated as part of that legacy of dispossession. But this particular incident, I'm afraid I'm not, embarrassingly, I'm not familiar with this particular incident. Yeah, if the questioner would like to elaborate, I'm not sure what I could offer, but I am curious. What was the name of the incident thing? I'm going to write it down. At the very least, I need to check into this.
So the Fort Laramie people eviction of the Grand Getaway Hotel.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I unfortunately, I apologize. I have to plead ignorance. I'm not sure of that familiar. I'm not sure of that particular incident. So yeah, I'm afraid to speak to it in any specific sense. At the very least, I'll say in a very, very, very general sense that, yeah, I mean, like it seems to play into a larger pattern of dispossession. So yeah, it's following a familiar playbook, if you will. But I'm afraid I'm gonna have to look into the specifics of this a little bit more closely. Yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of when we look at this field of genocide, we're constantly learning. So yeah. That I don't think you need to apologize for not knowing of the specific incident. So I do want to thank you so much, Professor Benvenuto, for your time today and for really giving an in-depth look into these counter arguments around the Indigenous community and why it's not genocide. And personally, I think debunking a lot of those myths as to why we need to look at a more formal recognition of the treatment of our Indigenous communities as a genocidal incident. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see everyone hopefully at the next session. Lots of great sessions this week with the Vanier College 30th Annual Symposium on Holocaust and Genocide. Please do continue to sign up, and we'll see you at the next session.